The Himalayan kingdom of Nepal was until recently one of the least explored parts of Asia. It was only in the early 1950s that outsiders were able to travel in that kingdom. At that time, I began the anthropological exploration of Nepal by a study of the Sherpas who live in the area of Mount Everest in Khumbu. Today, this eastern region of Nepal is very well known through the many mountaineering expeditions and also many tourists who travel from Kathmandu to Khumbu. But the whole northwestern part of Nepal is still an almost unexplored area, particularly the area of Humla in the extreme northwest. In 1972, I traveled from Jumla up to Rara, then a place called Simikot, and finally up to the Tibetan border, where the last village is Yari. Yari lies on a trade route which connects Nepal with Taklakot, a Tibetan market town, today of course controlled by the Chinese. And along this trade route, caravans of Tibetans and Nepalese move down along the Karnali River and into the middle ranges of Nepal to a place called Dulu, and then from Dulu even lower down to Surkhet, and then finally to the Indian border. This film begins in Dulu, which in the 14th and 15th century was an important historic center. Today, Dulu is a place without any political importance, but it used to be one of the main centers of the Malla kingdom, which throughout the 13th century extended over western Nepal, as well as the Tibetan regions of Purang and Guge. Stone pillars line many of the ancient roads constructed in Malla times. Yet the Hindu peasants who live among these relics of the past know little of their origin. But the names of the kings who ruled over this far-flung domain are engraved on a stone slab in Sanskrit characters. Only a day's journey from Dulu lies the small market town of Dailek, one of the administrative headquarters of the Karnali zone. The narrow streets of the town contain numerous shops, and in the marketplace, villagers and townspeople exchange their produce. Without motorable roads, Dailek has not much contact with the rest of Nepal, but a pagoda-style Hindu temple recalls the architecture of Kathmandu. The middle ranges to the north of Dailek, rising to 10,000 feet, are the home of high-caste Hindus. Many of them trace their ancestry to Rajput princes. Driven from their Indian homeland by Muslim invaders, they settled in the Himalayan valleys and became rulers over the local population. Above flights of irrigated terrace fields lies Kalikot, the ancient center of a line of Thakuri rulers stretching back over 12 generations. Today the people of Kalikot lead the life of simple farmers, but stone monuments dating from the 15th and 16th century bear witness to the one-time importance of their village. Most villages lie on the hill slopes, high above the river valleys, but occasionally there is an isolated house built close to a path frequented by travelers. Here the women make a small income by selling food and home-brewed beer. A notable group of ancient stone monuments, many shaped like Buddhist stupas, is found in the small village of Micha, not far from Jumla, the former seat of an important Thakuri ruler. We do not know why the kings of Jumla erected so many monuments on a single site, but there can be no doubt that at one time Micha must have been an important ritual center. The monuments are 300 to 400 years old, and the roughly carved inscriptions are in a form of Sanskrit. Many of the carvings on the stone pillars depict Buddhist symbols similar to those appearing on Tibetan paintings. When the Malla kingdom crumbled, Buddhism declined in the region of Jumla. Today this area is exclusively Hindu, and the Buddhist monuments mean little to the present population. Unlike the stone carvings, large and small wooden figures are still being produced in substantial numbers. Among the most characteristic motifs are warriors on horseback. They show that the idea of mounted warriors has still a place in the local folk memory. In the broad valley of the river Tilla lies the town of Jumla. The rice grown here at 7,500 feet is of a special variety, unknown in other parts of Nepal. Here too, relics of the Malla kingdom line the main paths. The majority of the village population consists of Thakuris and Chetris. Despite their high status in the caste system, they are hard-working farmers. Yet they have preserved the proud bearing of their warlike forefathers, and the women enjoy much greater freedom than Hindu women in other parts of Nepal. There's little prejudice against divorce, and the remarriage of divorced or widowed women is a general practice. The center of the old town of Jumla consists of a single broad street lined by low houses containing a few shops. The wares they offer have to be brought on man's or pony's back from the distant plains of India. Beyond Jumla stretches a belt of forested hills and large expanses of rolling pasture land. 2 days' journey through these hills brings you to the Sinja Valley, once the domain of a powerful Buddhist dynasty. In natural caves lying high above Sinja, clay objects with Buddhist inscriptions can be unearthed even today. Of the old buildings of Sinja, only the ruins of a fortress and a small temple remains. Though badly neglected, this temple is sometimes the scene of ritual performances. 2 stone lions survive as melancholic witnesses of a style of life which came to an end when Gurkha armies overthrew the rule of the Rajas of Sinja. Heavy flails are used for the threshing of millet. Hardly have the monsoon crops been harvested when the fields have to be ploughed before the sowing of the winter crops. The land is tilled with wooden ploughs, devoid of even the smallest iron point to serve as ploughshare, and the wooden spike of the plough has to be sharpened several times during a day's ploughing. The double cropping of the land demands ample manuring. A mixture of cattle manure, leaves and pine needles is spread all over the field. The spreading of the manure is women's work, and women also wield the iron hoes which are used to break up the hard clods of earth thrown up by the plough. While only men do the actual ploughing, by far the greatest part of the agricultural work is done by women. When the crops grow, they will do the weeding, and finally take their full share in the harvesting. At the end of the day's work, a man shoulders the light wooden plough and carries it to the village. Most of the farmers are freeholders, and there are no great inequalities of wealth. Yet some households have to employ daily laborers and pay them in grain. Before the laborers start the day's work, the employer has to provide a meal, and this is eaten on the open terrace in front of the house. The houses of the Thakuris are well-built, substantial structures. They usually have 3 stories, and wooden carvings of ram's heads embellish the front. Stone is the main building material, and stone steps lead up to the broad terrace in front of the house. Festivals and religious rites break the monotony of village life. In honor of one of the local gods, a high flagpole is erected. Before the flags are tied to it, a Brahmin priest smears the pole with red paint. The shrine of the god lies above the village, and on the flat roof of a nearby house, men of Thakuri caste are dancing and singing. Slowly and sedately, they shift around, with virtually no variations to the dance steps. And in their monotonous chant, the same phrases are repeated again and again. The women and children watch the dance without ever participating. Only after dark do women ever join in the dancing. The Hindus of the Jumla region have a custom unknown in most other parts of Nepal and very much at variance with normal Hindu morality. Groups of men and girls meet at night on clearings in the forest, dance and sing songs, and enjoy the food and drink they brought with them. Such picnics offer many opportunities for romantic encounters, and as young wives are not debarred from joining in the fun, the contacts made at these parties often lead to elopements and divorces. Drumming is an occupation of untouchables, and untouchable musicians function at all social and religious ceremonies. Untouchables may act also as shamans or spirit media. In Sinja, there are several of these shamans, and here they perform a ritual which culminates in their possession by gods. Purposely induced ecstasy is one of the means by which the people of Sinja, like many other Nepalese, establish contact with gods and spirits. In the state of trance, the shaman becomes a vehicle of a divinity who speaks to the people through the shaman's mouth. Constant drumming and the harsh blaring of pipes helps to induce an ecstatic trance. As the shaman abandons himself to the rhythm, his movements become wilder and wilder, and the excitement communicates itself to others in the crowd. One after the other of the shaman's assistants falls into trance and joins in his ecstatic dance. The capacity of being possessed by a god is not confined to members of any particular caste. Thakuris and even Brahmins can become shamans, but at this rite in Sinja, the shamans are all untouchables. When they are in trance, their own low status is suspended and they are regarded as a manifestation of a god. The possessed men cling tightly to each other and sometimes ride on each other's shoulders. This seems to symbolize the action of the gods who use human beings as their mount and vehicle, just like a rider uses a horse. The onlookers see the shamans not as their co-villagers, who in daily life follow the ordinary occupation of cultivators, but as manifestations of powerful deities. The attire of the shamans follows a traditional pattern. Round their neck and shoulders they have slung leather bands studded with small brass bells, and they wear short skirts rather than the usual tight Nepali trousers. The ritual leads up to the moment when the shaman turns oracle and answers questions asked by members of the crowd. The assumption is that a god or spirit speaks through his mouth. In many villages who have problems, such as the illness of a child, ask the shaman to reveal the cause of their trouble. The shaman answers their questions, usually surrounded by a crowd of onlookers, and his verdict, being derived from intuition, is often incapable of verification. Several women bring sick children and ask the shaman for a cure. Adults too approach the shaman with requests for help. A man suffering from internal pains is told that his illness stems from his having inadvertently eaten beef, an item tabooed among Nepalese Hindus, and is told that if he is to be cured, he must go on pilgrimage to the shrine of a certain god. Usually the seances of Nepalese shamans take place at night and generally within the small circle of an individual family. But here the seance occurs in the open and in broad daylight. Occasionally the shaman makes his pronouncement in a language other than Nepali and unknown to the bystanders. Might possibly be a Tibetan dialect which the shaman picked up from Tibetan travelers without himself fully understanding it. When the trance has worn off, the shaman has no recollection of his own pronouncements and prophecies. Journey to the north of Sinjar lies Lake Rara, recently renamed Lake Mahendra, after the late King Mahendra, the first Nepalese monarch ever to visit this remote part of the kingdom. Villages overlooking the lake are frequently visited by Bhotia traders carrying salt on the backs of their yak. The inhabitants of Rara village are the descendants of Thakuris from Jumla, ousted from their former domains. At Rara they found a safe refuge, but the move to an altitude of close on 10,000 feet forced them to accept a more frugal lifestyle. They built their houses solidly with double stone walls filled with rubble and a mixture of sand and mud. Such houses stand up well to the cold of the winter when villages are snowbound for long periods. While the upper floors are used as the living quarters, sheep and goats are kept on the ground floor. Every morning they are driven to nearby pastures, and children provide much of the labor required for the care of the animals. The Rara people are keen to maintain marriage alliances with families of equal status, and many marry their daughters to men of villages 10 or 12 days' journey away. Some 4,000 feet below the Rara lake lies the valley of the Mugu Karnali. The river is too large and too turbulent to be forded or crossed by boats. A rope bridge is the only means of getting men and loads across. The ropes are made of twisted grass, and as they tend to fray, they have to be frequently replaced. Travelers have to sit in a loop of rope fastened to a wooden yoke, which is dragged across the river. In the mountainous area north of the Karnali, villages are few and far between, and travelers have often to camp on the roadside and prepare their meals on open fires. They usually carry barley or wheat flour and make flat, unleavened bread. Here the villages are surrounded by terraced fields yielding crops of millet and amaranth, a small grain of bright red color usually eaten as porridge. In the region north of the Mugu Karnali, Mongoloid racial features increase in frequency. The people speak Nepali and claim to be Chetris, but Tibetan influence is unmistakable in the style of dress and ornaments. Children are scantily dressed, and in warm weather they often run about completely naked. But such clothes as they do wear are woven from local wool. Sheep are shorn twice a year, but wool is not the only material used for the production of textiles. The fiber of the bark of a shrub is also used for spinning thread, and such fiber thread is the raw material for the production of various textiles. The finished lengths of fiber cloth are folded for transport to distant markets. Much of the villagers' life goes on the flat roofs of the houses. It is now early autumn. The buckwheat has been harvested from clearings in the forest, and the women do the threshing. Many of the plots cleared of forest are irregular and full of stones. Ploughing with poorly trained bullocks is hard work, but it has to be done immediately after the buckwheat harvest in order to prepare the soil for the winter crops. Above 9,000 feet, dense rainforest covers the steep slopes, the trees festooned with moss. Higher still, pine trees take over from the deciduous forest. The route to Humla leads across the Margor Pass, some 13,000 feet high. To the north lies the valley of the Humla Karnali. Beyond it, the snow ranges which form the border between Nepal and Tibet. On the height of the pass, porters rest beside their loads and use the time for some mending of their footwear. From the Margor Pass it is 3 days to Simikot, a large flat ledge lying at an altitude of about 10,000 feet. It is intensively cultivated by the inhabitants of several nearby settlements of Chetris. In early October, buckwheat and several varieties of millet, as well as oilseeds, are ripening, and the women are busy with the harvest, singing as they cut the millet ears with small sickles. Most of the crops, and particularly buckwheat, are threshed with flails of a type common throughout western Nepal. Another method is the treading out of grain with bare feet. This is employed for the threshing of the delicate ears of amaranth and some small millets. In a few weeks' time, the first snow will fall, and men and women hasten to bring in large loads of hay. They are used from childhood to balancing the huge loads, and have no difficulty in negotiating the notched logs which serve as ladders. The bundles are stacked on the roofs and remain there until the hay has completely dried. Such stores of cattle fodder are essential, because villages and pastures may be snowbound from late October until April. While most sheep and goats are taken south to lower regions, cows and plough bullocks remain in Humla and depend on the stores of fodder. In the high valleys to both sides of the Humla Karnali lie villages inhabited entirely by Tibetan-speaking Bhotias. Here too the flat-roofed houses are built close together so that the villagers can move from one roof to the other. Newly dyed woolen cloth is spread out in the sun, and bundles of hay brought from the surrounding hill slopes are untied. The hay is then scattered all over the rooftop in preparation for storage. A daily task of the women is the pounding of grain, for all food grain has to be husked before it can be cooked or ground to flour. There are several large stone mortars in the village of Yakka, and women and girls bring their own pestles and the grain they want to pound. After the pounding, the grain is winnowed with the help of winnowing fans. Throughout the day, various activities are going on in the open verandas and on the flat roofs. Botias wear high cloth boots, and many men are skilled in making such boots. The soles of uncured leather are sewn to the woolen uppers. Women as well as men spin wool, and when there is no work to be done in the fields, the girls spend much of the day spinning. The wool is partly that of local sheep and partly obtained by barter from Tibet. The women of Yakpa are exceedingly gay and self-possessed. Even young girls are widely traveled, and many have been to Kathmandu, Darjeeling and Kalimpong. Like other Botias, the people of Humla practice the Tibetan custom of polyandry. Many women have two husbands, usually brothers, and the children address both husbands as father. The early onset of cold weather with falls of snow on the high pastures makes it necessary to prepare for the bringing down of the cattle to the pastures close to the village. As there are still some standing crops, fences will have to be mended and paths blocked. Shouting from a rooftop, the wife of the village headman calls the village elders together. The elders assemble and sit in a semicircle to discuss the arrangement for the moving of the cattle. Opinions are divided. There's a good deal of argument in which the women join with gusto. After more than an hour's debate, agreement is finally reached. The people of Yakpa also worship various tribal deities, and here a sheep has been killed and is being cut up. The heart and liver will be roasted and offered to the god. The village guardian then mixes buckwheat flour with water and prepares a dough suitable for making sacrificial figures. These are similar to the conical torma used in Buddhist ritual. 13 of these figures are prepared. They are decorated with spike-like pieces of dough put into a brass dish and then placed on a crude stone altar. Next, the smoking frying pan containing cooked food offerings is put on the altar. Before the final rite, the priests wash their faces. While the priests chant, several other offerings are placed on the altar. At the end of the ceremony, the villagers celebrate the festival with singing and dancing. The type of dance and the accompanying songs are very similar to those of other Tibetan-speaking people of the Himalayas. Botia girls enjoy great freedom, and there is complete equality of the sexes. Their clothes are of homespun wool, and their rich ornaments contain coral and turquoise beads of very considerable value. Many Bhotia communities have two settlements, one in a relatively sheltered valley and one close to the high pastures. During the summer and early autumn, the people of Dinga live in this settlement at an altitude of close on 12,000 feet. The houses are well built and the flat roofs are the scene of many domestic activities. Radishes are an important crop. They are cut into slices and then spread out on the roof to dry. They are preserved to be eaten in the winter or used for barter with Tibetans. Dinga women weave throughout the year, and even at a time when there is agricultural work to be done. The loom is of the stretch type, and it can be rolled up and taken from one place to the other. The wool of local sheep is not as fine as that of Tibetan sheep, but supplies of Tibetan wool have become scarce because the Chinese rulers of Tibet discouraged the export of this commodity. The raising of livestock is an essential factor in the economy of all inhabitants of Humla, and its importance increases in proportion to the altitude of settlements and the diminishing agricultural production. Yak are bred from 10,000 feet upwards and are kept exclusively by Bhotias. They are bred not only for their milk and meat and their carrying capacity in high and rugged country, but also for the crossing with common cattle. The resulting hybrids command high prices among the Bhotias' Hindu neighbors, and the breeders themselves value the cows for their high milk yield and use the bulls as pack animals and for plowing. Next to the breeding of yak, the Bhotias of Humla pay great attention to the raising of sheep and goats. They are of vital importance as the only pack animals which can negotiate the routes to the middle ranges and endure the hot climate of the lower country, where yak cannot be used. The pastoral economy of the Humla Bhotias inevitably involves seasonal moves between regions of different altitudes, and this is facilitated by the possession of alternative houses within easy reach of grazing grounds above the tree line. In the autumn, Bhotias move with their herds to their villages in the lower valleys, where the animals find grazing when the higher pastures are already affected by frost. This annual exodus from the high pastures brings the people back into the forested valleys and to such villages as Karmi, a cluster of houses clinging to one of the slopes which drops into Humla Karnali. Stone structures and natural boulders bearing Tibetan inscriptions indicate the Buddhist tradition of Karmi. Even the foreheads of yak skulls are incised with sacred formulae. The women carrying water from the spring have to pass these religious monuments several times a day, and as they do so, they automatically murmur a brief prayer. Their domestic work involves a great deal of carrying and fetching, and their loads are often as heavy as those borne by men. Their dress, too, is similar to that of men. Traditionally, both men and women wear their hair long, and there is not much difference in the appearance of the two sexes. On the main trade routes along the Humla Karnali, there are innumerable steep climbs, strenuous for men and pack animals. The deep gorges are spanned by wooden cantilever bridges. One of these bridges lies on the approach to the Buddhist temple of Muchu. This temple had fallen into neglect until a Tibetan reincarnate Lama took an interest in its restoration. The Lama, whose reputation has spread throughout the Bhotia community of Humla, had inspired the local population to give their labor free. The roof has to be virtually remade. Earth and sand are drenched with water and then steadily pounded till the resultant plaster forms a rain-resisting cover. While the rebuilding was in process, the statues and ritual objects had been set up in a tent. With the building of the temple nearly completed, the reincarnate Lama has ordered their return to the temple, and this is the occasion for a solemn ceremony. Among the statues is one of Guru Rinpoche, the patron saint of the Nyingmapa order, and he is followed by lamas carrying a whole library of hand-printed books. White ceremonial scarves to be draped over the statues are prominently carried in the procession. Inside the temple, monks and nuns accompany the solemn ritual with the playing of drums, oboes and cymbals. Offerings and butter lamps have been set out on the altar, and the monks prostrate themselves before the images. Though Muchu is a small village, some 36 lamas and nuns have gathered for the inauguration of the newly restored temple. Tibetan Buddhism, banned in its homeland by the Chinese communists, has found a refuge in Nepal, and the fervor of old and young lamas preserves the cultural heritage which Nepal has long shared with Tibet. From the newly restored temple of Muchu, it is only one day's journey to Yari, the last village before the Tibetan border. In the regions of high altitude, caravans of yak are a usual sight. Prayer flags flying on the roofs of the houses of Yari are visible signs of the Buddhist faith. Like other Bhojas of Humla, the villagers are Tibetan in speech, culture and appearance. The harvest of the barley, the main crop of Yari, is just over, and there's great activity on all the threshing floors. Unlike the Bhotias of the lower valleys, who thresh their crops by hand, the people of Yari use yak and sometimes horses to tread out the barley. Yari lies at the lower end of a broad valley amid extensive pasture land, which provides ample grazing for yak and sheep. The main route from Humla to Tibet leads through this valley and ascends to the Nara La, a pass well over 16,000 feet in height. The Nara Pass was one of the links between the southern and the trans-Himalayan part of the historic Mala Kingdom, and it remains the gateway to the region of Taklakot. Looking northwards and across the political frontier from the Nara Pass, one sees far into Tibet. There the landscape is almost devoid of vegetation, but near some small villages there are some patches of cultivated land. Taklakot is the market town where for centuries the people of Humla exchanged rice and other grains for the salt and wool of Tibet. The local Tibetans also used the route across the Nara to come for trade to Nepal. For some years, Tibetan traders were not allowed to leave Tibet with their caravans of yak or sheep, but now the restrictions imposed by their Chinese rulers have been relaxed, and Tibetans from the vicinity of Taklakot can once again cross over into Nepal. A large flock of Tibetan carrier sheep and goats are arriving at the approaches to Yari. They are of a long-haired variety, different from the sheep and goats bred in Nepal. The Tibetans who have come with them store the bags of salt in the houses of friends and trade partners. They have come to barter the salt for the rice, wheat and barley which the Yari people obtain from the lower regions of Nepal. But they cannot dispose of all the salt at once, because there are not yet sufficient supplies of grain at Yari. The older traders wear traditional Tibetan dress, but the young men sport Chinese caps and Mao buttons. Many of the Tibetan traders have friends and kinsmen in Yari, and they are offered hospitality whenever they come. The hostess prepares tea and churns it with butter and salt. The salted tea is served from an earthen teapot and drunk from delicate porcelain cups, which were imported from Tibet many years ago and are among the treasured possessions of many Bhotias. The whole of Upper Humla is dependent on trade, and it is mainly the barter of Nepalese grain for Tibetan salt which has always been the mainstay of this trade. The people of the high Limi Valley, which adjoins Humla to the north, regularly go to Taklakot, and the salt they obtain there is carried on the backs of yak. The path leads along rocky cliffs, and at some difficult spots the yak have to be unloaded and their loads carried by men. With so many obstacles, the progress of such a caravan is slow, and it may be held up altogether by an unseasonable fall of snow. The snowfall in which the caravan was caught near the village of Karmi lasted only 2 days, but in late October it was unexpected, and it upset the travel arrangements of many traders. Passes were blocked earlier than usual, and this compelled caravans to make long detours. The boys of Karmi celebrate the first fall with a game of snowball. At a time of the year when snow soon melts in the sun, the flat roofs have to be cleared before the melting snow seeps into the house. A characteristic feature of Humla is the many mills where people grind their grain. They are arranged in series with water flowing through channels and wooden ducts from one mill to the next. The mills are a convenient place for people from adjoining villages to meet and to exchange news while they wait their turn. In the nearby village, the men of a family have arrived from Taklakot, where they bartered food grains for salt. They obtained 2.5 measures of salt for 1 measure of barley and 5 measures of salt for 1 measure of rice. After a short rest in their house, they will transfer the salt to a sheep caravan and take it to one of the rice-growing areas to the south. Autumn is the time when many people of Humla set out for the middle ranges and the lowlands. The salt which during the summer they obtained in Taklakot or from Tibetan traders is now filled into sacks. At the same time, food grain and flour has to be packed as ration for the traders. The preparation for the long trek south requires much thought and care, for the traders have to start with rations to last them for the many days of the journey through villages where there is no surplus of grain, and the people do not want to barter their supplies for salt. With hundreds of animals to carry the salt south, the loading is a laborious task. 2 sacks of about 20 pounds each are the normal load of a strong sheep or goat. Some of the salt bags are made of leather, others of stout yak hair cloth. A pair of bags connected by a piece of cloth is placed on each animal and firmly strapped to its belly. To load a flock of 50 to 100 sheep and goats takes a very long time, yet it is a task which has to be repeated twice a day, once in the early morning and once after the midday break. The route to the south leads at first through the valley of the Humla Karnali. In November, when all the sheep owners of Humla set out for the middle ranges, there is a steady stream of caravans, some of as little as 50 and others of 250 or even 300 sheep. All along the route one finds encampments of people who rest while their flocks graze on the hill slopes. Here is a group of Dangali Kambas. They are members of a small community of some 60 families who are entirely nomadic. They have no settled homes and move between Acham, Humla and Taklakot. The traditional trading system of the people of Humla was based on the fact that in Tibet grain is much more valuable than salt, while in the middle ranges of Nepal, salt used to have 8 times the value of grain. While communications between India and the Nepalese lowlands were poor, hardly any Indian salt penetrated into Nepal, and the entire need for salt was met by imports from Tibet. Some routes are passable only for sheep and goats, but on others pack ponies and yak crossbreeds can also be used. It takes the caravan several weeks to reach the rice-growing regions of the middle ranges. On the way there, they pass the belt of forest country interspersed with large expanses of pasture land. On these winter migrations, even young animals who cannot carry are taken along, because there is no grazing in the snow-covered high valleys. Also older sheep and goats, no longer strong enough to carry a full load, are taken south to be sold to Hindu villagers for slaughter. The first objective on these winter migration is the substantial villages of Hindu populations which have a surplus of grain. Subida, a Thakuri village on a high slope above the Tilla River, is one of the places where there is a surplus of grain, and traders from Humla find a market for their salt. Subita lies outside the relatively arid zone in the rain shadow of the Himalayas, and the house style reflects the different climate. Agriculture is here the sole base of the economy, and the people are much less mobile than those of the higher regions. The rice terraces are skillfully engineered and irrigated, and much effort is spent on the manuring. Bhotia traders with caravans of sheep often pass through Subita, but occasionally the village is visited also by Bhotias carrying salt on the backs of yak crossbreeds, which in the winter months can be taken as far south as the Tilla Valley. The profits the traders of Humla can make have recently declined. Even a generation ago, they bartered salt in the middle ranges for 8 times the volume of rice, but today the barter rate is only 1 to 1. Yet the seasonal nomadism is a way of life which the people of the highlands cannot easily abandon. Sheep and goats must be taken to regions free of snow where they find pasture during the winter, and the herdsmen are used to camping wherever there is suitable grazing for their flocks. There they spend their days spinning and weaving, and many of the blankets produced on their portable looms are sold to the villagers of the lower regions. As the caravans from the high valleys approach the lowlands, they converge with another flow of seasonal migrants. Many Brahmins, Thakuris and Chetris from villages in the middle ranges also move southward to avoid the cold of the winter and to find better grazing for their cattle. The whole elaborate pattern of movements of people, animals and goods depends to a large extent on the possibility of selling Tibetan salt to the producers of a surplus of rice grown in the lower regions of Nepal. If the needs of these agricultural populations were to be met entirely by supplies of cheap Indian salt, the whole system would break down. Today many of the traders and herdsmen head for Surkhet, a small town in a broad flat valley at about 2,000 feet. Until a few years ago, this valley was infested with a malignant type of malaria and was habitable only during the winter. But when in the 1960s an anti-malaria program eradicated the disease, people moved into the valley, and within a few years a small market town had grown up. On the flat fields outside the town of Surkhet, Bhotias from the higher ranges are camping throughout the winter, grazing their large herds of horses. Many of them are Khambas from some villages northeast of Jumla. The men dress mainly Nepalese style, but the women wear their traditional Tibetan style clothes and ornaments. In their camp outside Surkhet, they behave exactly as they do in their home village, and they have no feeling of inferiority vis-à-vis the townspeople of Surkhet. The women weave blankets and woolen cloth on stretch looms, as well as the more complicated treadle loom, and they soften the wool of their sheep by beating it with sticks. The outlook for these semi-nomadic groups is a gloomy one, for the improvement of communications will inevitably erode the whole basis of their delicately balanced economy. The trading pattern is already changing. Light planes taking 2 hours to Jumla from Kathmandu can carry goods more cheaply than the cost of the 3-week trek over rugged country. And in Kathmandu, the political center of the kingdom, people know little of the distant mountain regions in the extreme west of Nepal. Amid the historic buildings of their ancient city, they are absorbed in their own affairs and in the celebration of the innumerable rituals and festivals which are a feature of life in Kathmandu and the neighboring town of Partam. Colorful crowds composed of members of many castes and ethnic groups jostle each other in narrow streets and in the courtyards of temples where Hindu and Buddhist deities are worshipped side by side. The Bhotias of Humla seldom visit Kathmandu. There is a world of difference between their tranquil life in the high mountains and the bustling crowds of the capital. Yet the city dwellers of Kathmandu and the mountain dwellers of Humla are both characteristic strands in the complex fabric of the civilization of Nepal.